with education and those sorts of things as well. So we have to get those investments for youth at a young age, so they have other areas to turn to besides that, and also dealing with the sometimes overt racism from police forces as well. We all know about carding. In London, that was a big practice. I've been carded there myself several times. I was just telling a story. First time I was in Saskatchewan, I was there for 20 minutes, and I ended up in the back of a police cruiser. And don't worry, I didn't do anything. I was innocent. But I checked into a hotel there, and I usually like to take a walkabout. And so I was about a couple blocks away from the hotel, and I matched the description of somebody apparently, and I ended up in the back of a cruiser there. So that's just the kind of stuff that we face all the time, and so that's the kind of stuff we have to stop. And so actually, I was supposed to be addressing some of the London committees on racism too pretty soon. So I have some invitations to do that. So the Joint Technical Table will continue to work to secure political and technical meetings with the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, and Ministry of Child and Youth Services, because those are ministries that all have an impact on us, because a lot of those, because of the split in federal and provincial jurisdiction, separation of powers, a lot of sometimes we refer to the province as the Little Crown, because they do have authority over certain things like health and policing and those sorts of things. So we do have to deal directly with the province on a lot of these kind of issues. We have to identify key contacts for each of the ministries that influence areas impacting health, and like Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Seniors Affairs, Ministry of Child and Youth Services. So there's a lot of work to be done, so which we're going to continue to advocate that we continue this relationship, and hope and ensure that Premier Ford keeps up this ministry, because it's been quite integral in moving ahead on a lot of our issues. Otherwise, there wouldn't really be anywhere in Ontario for us to go to get them addressed. So that's something that we're going to continue doing and advocating for. So it's sort of a new relationship, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but that's something that we continue to press to move forward. And that doesn't prevent any individual First Nation from getting their individual issues and going directly to the ministry. So this is probably more for collective type issues that we're going to have, and getting some work done with regards to those. So again, it's not taking anything away from the nation-to-nation relationship that the member nations would have either. This is just joint advocacy on the common issues. So anyway, at this time, I'd like to open it up for any kind of questions anyone may have with regards to that. Yes, sir. Yes. Okay, thank you. Oh, I got cut off. All right. Oh, I'm back on. All right. Over to you, Chair.
Miigwech, Grand Chief, for that update. Forgive me before we move any forward here, accepting motions. If you could please just state your name and nations, as I'm not quite familiar with everyone here. So I'm looking for a mover and a seconder to accept the bilateral update. Chief Miracle? Chief Dean? Any oppositions? Seeing none, motion carried. Chief Dean. Next up, we have Deputy Grand Chief Gord Peters and Gina McCackney doing a presentation on education and an update on the bilateral process and resolutions. So I'd like to welcome them up to give their presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm going to do the education presentation. There are several parts to this belonging to different members of the education department who I will identify as I go through. On the first slide is the engagement process, and this belongs to Kyla. what the engagement process is doing, it's asking the questions about how to deal with the funding processes and what makes up regional agreements and how people should be organized in order to receive funding. So it's a use of $665 million from the federal budget in 2016. AI members will conclude a regional agreement and a transition into an interim formula. And so a region can be defined as a single community, a language family, tribal councils, etc. And so that's the key part of being able to understand, because when they did the amalgamation process, they wanted several communities to band together as an amalgamation. And so the good news is that in the engagement process, it's a single community being able to go forward. On the second slide, you'll see a formulation of an interim funding formula, and it's basically talking about the barriers to developing a community-based education budget. Oh, hey, I'm responsible for the clicker. Sorry, I've never been this responsible for have the clicker and everything with me. So this is talking about the barriers, and remember, this is an engagement process, and so there's some ongoing research on adaptations, additions, proxies, support service maps, high spec ed, and understanding of funding blocks. And so there's a significant amount of dialogue that's going on what those potentials might be able to look like. And in the next slide, the question becomes, what should be involved in the development of community-based education? And so here you have a list of everybody who should be involved. And the ongoing research is around the existing agreements and templates that people have. Again, the supportive service maps, leverage of community members, language immersion. So there are a whole list of areas that they believe that should be involved in the education process. So how would you measure success of an established community-based budget? And so these are some of the areas of evaluation that people began to look at as they started to put them into place. Program evaluation standards, performance evaluations, baseline evaluations, student success, graduation rates. And I think all of this is pointing to the fact that a lot of the times we don't keep data and information, or the information that we get we don't share with anybody else other than with the federal government. And so it's a process of being able to garner our own data and to be able to look at how we're going to create our own data systems in order for us to be able to track our own students and the successes that our students have. The second one is the federal language. This belongs to GINA, and we're tracking the language. There was a commitment for a new language legislation, and so there are two processes at work here. One is the education portion of the language, and so they construct that process within education. The second portion is the public language institute that they're talking about that will come out of Heritage. And so when the discussions began, there was a National Working Committee, there was a AFN Language Leadership Committee. There's a second round of engagement. I know I've seen a number of people there. I went there to check it out. And National Language Engagement Session in September 13 and 14. And that will roll up into a guide to co-develop the language legislation. And I'm sure that there's been a tremendous amount of work already on the language process that's gone ahead. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about what that's going to look like, how it's going to be getting out to communities, and how you're going to be able to access that. Post-secondary. This is a First Nations-led federal comprehensive review of the post-secondary education. So there's a full suite that's going to be looked at, determine policy and funding changes to best meet the needs of First Nations. There's two tables, one on institutions, one on students. The possibility of this process getting underway will be in the fall of 2018. This is the bilateral process on education as you see it here in front of you. What you'll see on the left-hand side of the column, which you can barely see on the left-hand side of the column, I should say, is about the issues identified to address educational impacts on First Nations education systems. And so there's a list: relationships, consultation and consent, jurisdiction recognition, legal obligations, language, recourse, native trustee, data sharing, school boards, etc. So all of that belongs on one side. So in the center, you'll see what work that they require in order to be able to make the change. And so they're looking at developing positions and processes on issues that comes out of this work that's going on and the work that's going on with Gina, and develop a work plan to address those. So there have been some outcomes. There's some meetings to be held with MER. There's a letter of the Ministry of Education for joint meetings. All of these issues that are ongoing. And so you'll see some of these are all may or may not continue based on the new government and the new relationships that we may or may not have going forward. So this is about entrance into post-secondary, and we've discussed this a few times, that sometimes the courses that we run aren't eligible to enter into post-secondary. And so what happens to our kids is that they're sent back into another process to be able to achieve a higher standing. What we're looking to do is to change the process to reflect courses to reflect as U as university level or M as mixed, so that there's some coding, and that will ensure that those localized work that communities do, any kind of land-based things that community does and everything, that those will be recognized as entrance points into university. So the outcome again is meetings with MER, letters to the Minister of Education, and of course meetings that have been held to have those discussions. So here's the next. Starts at the top with the task groups. Goes around. Task groups are set up already. There's dates for meetings, terms of reference, best practices. And you see right in the middle, what does it say? Election outcomes. And so I think everybody's waiting to see what happens with their work within the provincial government. So this one is about post-secondary housing subsidies. Did I jump? I did. Lifelong learning. I missed this. So this lifelong learning belongs to That's what I thought you said, Joan. Belongs to Joan. And so so there have been changes to the system that we're being apprised of, and changes in curriculum that have happened to date. And currently, the social studies from grade 4 to 6, the history, Canadian history since WW2 have been updated. They're looking to begin that process for July of 2018. So the Chiefs of Ontario in this process has made it clear that in every aspect they need to be included, from curriculum writing to teacher training. And by the way, that teacher training process is already in place for this summer. Education Service Agreement, Reciprocal Education Service Agreement. So currently, the basic document that we've been talking about has been attached to another bill that will go before the Ontario government. I don't know if that's happened or not, or the times just ran out with respect to Ontario. And it has to do with the classification of schools as AI community schools. We have federal schools, but all of our other schools are designated as private schools. So that's going to be outstanding at this point. So the lifelong learning, the second session of community engagement again in February. There were meetings, final session held in February. The questions and answers were compiled into a report sent to the Chiefs of Ontario. The final report will be provided this June in the Assembly. 5 areas of priority: language and culture, relationships, curriculum, information access and accountability, and policy development. OSAP transformation. OSAP announced this a couple of years ago almost already, that any family that made income less than $50,000 would be eligible for funding. When that happened, we didn't realize there was 2 parts to it. There was one from the provincial part and one from the federal part. So they've been working on that and trying to figure it out. But by the change of the current format that they've been working on right now, our students have been able to access those programs. So that's a real bonus in terms of this. So the first-year program is operated with the assistance of First Nations Post-Secondary Council, and so we expect more changes, but more additional help to our post-secondary students. The Education Partnership Program. Belongs to post-secondary Shirley Miller. The Education Partnership is a 5-year agreement between AI and the Ministry of Education and Indigenous Services, and so it's a multi-year agreement between the province of Ontario and the federal government. There's a number of projects that will be carried out, and they're in this area. The projects support relationship building, data sharing, and language revitalization. So here's some of the initiatives that the partnerships have supported to date: family and community engagement, language revitalization, data sharing protocols, the United Graduation Coaching Project, the United Sign Language Project, Batchewana Student Wellbeing, WATA sharing of expertise in the classroom, adaptive learning models, new teacher induction manual, youth development camp, promising practices workshop, Education Directors Forum, Partnership Relationship Strategies. Sorry, I got kept up there. Whoa. I'm lost. Oh, no, I'm not. There are 5 First Nations who opted into the joint agreement, and you see them listed right there. Those are the participants. Those are the ones that the projects are being able to be done through: Caldwell, Delaware, Oneida, Wata, and Batchewana. My last slide is the need to investigate the development of an AI data collection system to ensure other organizations currently hold our data, that we can get access to those. We still have OCAP principles that are in place. Research data that other organizations currently have. What we receive right now is called interpretive data. What we require is raw data in order for us to be able to determine for ourselves what's going on. So we're trying to better align our students with success standards and to know what happens to our children in the system. So being able to do that kind of analysis, it must be supported in that sense of being able to know that we can collect data as well, and we can decipher our own data, and we can churn that out to be able to best support our students. There's a therefore being resolved at the end, but I don't know why. Is it a resolution? It will come forward, and there'll be a resolution on this coming forward. But that's the education update, and as you can see, some of these areas, key areas, really hinge on what happens with the new Ontario process. The other work that's continuing on is of course the joint initiative, which is there. The languages program is continuing on, so all of those will continue and continue to move forward. And so we'll see and we'll continue to see the successes for our young people as they go through all the stages of lifelong learning.
The resolution is already on 009.
Miigwech, Deputy Grand Chief. So there is a motion required to accept the education update as presented. So resolution number 9, data systems model options. Therefore be it resolved, the General Grand Assembly agrees to establish an education data system working group along with terms of reference to oversee the development of a data system model options, process and recommended next steps. Further be it resolved, AIA will facilitate engagement processes with member nations to assist in the development and ratification of an AIAI database system. Finally, be it resolved, the General Grand Assembly directs AIAI to research the development of data systems, model options based on the above principles, and to present the findings to the member nations on the recommended AIAI database systems for ratification and participation. So we have a mover, moved by Kathleen Dockstader, Oneida Nation of the Thames, seconded by Brent Stonefish, Delaware Nations. Do we have any comments from the mover or the seconder? Any comments from the delegates? Call for a vote. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the resolution is carried by consensus. What do we have next? Moving forward, is this one? Moving forward, we have a presentation on social development delivered to you by Chief Lori Carr from Hiawatha First Nation and Chief Randall Phillips, Oneida Nation of the Thames. They'll be touching upon family revitalization and social assistance.
Ani bojo wawash keshto dem megase kwe dishnakas Lori Jaganash Noswin Michisagi Nishna Bayandao. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lori Carr. My spirit name is Eagle Woman. I'm from the Deer Clan, and I am Michisagi from Hiawatha First Nation. And I would like to start with giving thanks. I didn't do that earlier, and I'd like to thank Oneida, the Oneida Chief and Council, elders, the chiefs and councils and delegates in the room, and the Eagle staff and all sacred items that are in the room. Miigwech. Also, before I start into this presentation, I would like to do an acknowledgement of my colleague and friend, Chief Randall Phillips. As you know, Chief Phillips is retiring from politics, and fitting that we are here in his community of Oneida. I've known Randy for over 10 years and have learned from him, and I give him thanks for that. He has a strong communication skill. It's very direct, straightforward, and again, I appreciate this. You always know where you stand. He has always used this communication to uphold his community, speak up for his people and his community, and to ensure Oneida interests are front and center for advancement. So I just wanted to do this little acknowledgement for Randy and say miigwech for all that he's taught me. Thank you. So Randy and I are co-portfolio holders on this social file, and we're going to do an overview of the family revitalization, child welfare reform, Ontario Indigenous Children and Youth Strategy, Children and Youth Families Act, the technical table on child family being, and social assistance, basic income, the Journey Together, and the National First Nations Early Learning and Child Care Framework. I'm not going to read to you from the slides. You heard a lot of this information yesterday from the Grand Chief, who is the social portfolio at the regional level. and stole all our thunder yesterday.
I know, sorry.
So we'll start with Randy.
Sagolis wakwe patli yangyats anyata ag uglari nagitolo. Good afternoon, everybody, and I just wanted to say thank you to Chief Carr for her comments. It wasn't something that we talked about, and no matter how much of a loudmouth I am, I'm still fairly humble in terms of what other people talk about me, so I appreciate that. The reason that there's two of us here is because I think you've heard over the last few days that this has been a very important issue for us for a long time, certainly for me. Ever since I was elected chief first time 14 years ago, this was the key issue for me, and I kept on pushing it. We've made slight changes with respect to the ministry over the years, but that's what I guess I've learned, is that it's incremental change. Things don't change overnight, but you got to keep pushing that ball down up that hill. So we've made some things, and I think what we're going to talk about over the next little while with some of these activities is a reflection of that change and that positive movement where we are, but it's also important. So the first slide that we've got here is just this AI revitalization working group. You know that we've had discussions with this in all of our communities. Right? It's a technical bilateral table. It's a forum for our community members to bring out these issues, talking about what's happening at home with respect to child welfare, talking about potential reforms, talking about relationships, all of those types of things. This working group works with the Ministry of Children and Youth Services in this whole piece of reform. So I just want to let you know, in terms of this bigger picture, there's all kinds of little avenues coming in with respect to reform. This is one of the ways that we are involved with this. This will also be part of Stephen's report, which I'll talk about next. So next slide, please. So, and again, this fits into the same piece that we've been talking about before with regards to AIAI's involvement in this whole reform picture. Quick background: the Ontario government, or the federal government, committed to a revised change in terms of the child welfare system that affects First Nations children right across Canada. Here in Ontario, we've got a special relationship under the 1965 agreement. So there's a couple of things that we've had to push, but we've got this reform, and of course what federal government, everybody's talking about is engagement. This is one of our engagement processes. Again, as far as I'm concerned as chief, it's not adequate enough because it doesn't come down to the community level. It's still at the regional level, but it's a step. So again, this is just one of the ways that we continue to be involved with AI in the community to push this. So there's never any single push. We're involved in all of these processes right up to the top. Okay. All right.
Under the Ontario Indigenous Children and Youth Strategy, there are recent initiatives out of this strategy that include Child Welfare Jurisdiction, Children, Youth, and Family Services Act review and implementation, Youth Life Promotions, and Family Violence Family Wellbeing Program. The strategy intends to look and change how Indigenous youth, children, and family programs across the board are accessed and funded to better support the needs of Indigenous groups. Under the Act, it came into effect April 30th this year and replaces the Child Family Services Act. And then we move into the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. In response to this decision, the Tribunal has ordered Indigenous Services Canada to cease its discriminatory practices and reform the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and the 1965 Indian Welfare Agreement to reflect the findings of the CHRT decision. The order to fund band representatives is to be in place until the Tribunal says otherwise. Canada may not divert other funds, including funds earmarked for prevention, to the band representative program. There is no endpoint to the order to fund actual costs for mental health services. Indigenous Services Canada is expected to provide more details on how they will be funding band representative and mental health services in the near future. The Chiefs of Ontario Social Services Coordination Unit is comprised of the PTOs and independent First Nations social services development directors and senior technicians. And our representative on that committee is Zachariah General. And the SSCU reports to the Chiefs Committee on Social and provides recommendations. And they seek directions from the Chiefs Committee regarding the progress of the technical table on child and family well-being. And again, on the Chiefs Committee is Chief Phillips and myself. All right. And we'll move on to the technical table. Or continue on. The Chiefs in Assembly passed Resolution 2217 at the Special Chiefs Assembly in October of 2017. That resolution provided direction to the Chiefs of Ontario to implement the Ontario First Nations Limited Partnership formula as an interim funding formula. With the first allocations in 2018-19, and the allocation is $12.4 million. The Chiefs of Ontario are in the process of coordinating an Ontario special study, which will conduct environmental scan of current child and family systems and provide recommendations. On April 12th, Minister Philpott and Minister Couture, along with First Nations leadership, signed a commitment to child and family services reform.
Chief Carr's way taller than I am, so I gotta keep moving this. But in just that other regard, I wanted to make a note here that Canada and Ontario signed an agreement with respect to moving child welfare reform. So Chief Carr didn't mention that piece, but it's very important that we've got this document now signed by Canada and Ontario to move forward on reform. So all of our communities that are in that, please use that document. Right? Again, it's just one of these instruments that we fought long and hard for, at least to get this recognition. So at least we're there. So sorry there, Chief Carr, we should have mentioned that earlier. Next one, please. So again, I'm coming back to this whole notion of reform, right? So you can see from this slide that the process in terms of reform has started. From the other previous slides, we could show you the 2 or 3 elements that we have as AIA developed so that we're hearing from our communities to participate in this reform. Zachariah has rejoined us from the Chiefs of Ontario. I think that's an excellent move for AIAI, and we'll let Zachariah talk about that move on his own accord. But he's a very smart, intelligent young man. He knows what's going on. He's also had that experience in terms of the Chief of Ontario level to get a better understanding in terms of the other PTOs too. So we're very lucky to have Zachariah involved with us, especially at this time in terms of this kind of reform. We've also got Samantha Miracle from the Tainanega, and she's also participating in this group too as well. So, and again, we'll let AIAI continue to inform our chiefs about these updates, and I know that at least Oneida has a working group, and I'm sure that the other communities have that too. Again, let's encourage continued participation with respect to that. No. And I'm also glad we got 3 interpreters here so that we can just fly right through this stuff, right, Dominique? Anyways, this next piece here is, again, the First Nations recommendation. in regards to this reform on income security. INAC had done the studies. They started a study years ago with regards to looking at income security changes. There are some talk about the notion of how this will be translated to dealing with First Nations governments. Do we take over ODSP? Do we get the resources for that? How much continual will we do that? They've even talked about special income support programs that are going on. We're still in the phase in terms of doing the research to see whether or not how First Nations communities can be involved and participate in that. But in terms of its ongoing, it's the joint working table. Again, we've all got representatives, or we should have representatives on that table. Please, I've been fighting for this for 15 years, so please, communities, I would say, make sure we participate. Just on that note, I wanted to say that from an AIAI perspective, we started that Chiefs Committee on Social. I was instrumental in starting that as the Chiefs Committee on Child Welfare. It got changed to Social, but our representative at that Chiefs Committee has always been there. So I just want to let you know that we've always had solid representation, at least in the area of child welfare reform. Chief Carr? Am I still up? I'm still up. Okay. Sorry, Greg, I tried to shut up, but they want me to keep talking, so. And again, this is, I think, what I alluded to earlier is this notion of this basic income pilot project, right? There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 areas right now in Ontario that they're testing this out. Hamilton, Brantford, Thunder Bay, and Lindsay, which is just outside of Peterborough. The pilots are looking how basic income systems might improve health, education, and job prospects for those living in low incomes. Resolution 2717 basically sought one First Nation pilot site for each PTO and independent First Nation, and I'm not quite sure, Zachariah, whether or not that was followed up. That was a request. And the recommendations also to the ministry included that the First Nations pilots needed to be co-developed with those First Nations communities. And basically this is, I think, another piece of what we've talked about and being involved in this overall reform. We know that the current rates are a challenge within First Nations communities and that they don't apply. And this is part of why we got this specifically Ontario-specific study on the go. We've been after them for years and years and years to kind of do some kind of comparison with the 1965 welfare agreement. How can we benefit from that? How can we push that to get more resources in our communities? But they kept on saying, well, we need to study this, study this, study this. So this is their attempt. And I don't think it goes far enough as far as I'm concerned in terms of First Nations communities, what we wanted set up in the first place, but it's another piece in terms of that long step for reform. So I'm stepping back now.
The Journey Together, this early years program is to expand child and family programming in the community, and the majority of AI communities have submitted their proposals and received approvals. This piece here is just a FYI for your information. You're up. You want it? On the National First Nations Early Learning and Childcare Framework, the federal budget of 2016 committed to ensuring and supporting Indigenous peoples in identifying priorities, strategies, and actions for improving access to quality early childhood and other family strengthening supports, while developing Indigenous capacity to reassume control of early childhood and child care. In February of 2017, in accordance with the Assembly First Nations resolution, First Nations National Working Group on Early Learning and Childcare and AFN National Expert Early Learning and Childcare Working Group was established to oversee and implement a community engagement process. An Ontario engagement to provide Ontario's feedback in the First Nation National Framework was organized by the Chiefs of Ontario in 2017. That's the end of our presentation. Questions? Zachariah will be happy to answer them.
Zachariah.
Miigwech Chief Carr and Chief Phillips for that presentation. So there is a motion required to accept the social development update as presented by Chief Carr and Chief Phillips. So I'm looking for a mover and a seconder. Mover. Counsel. Can you repeat your name, please? Sorry. Stacy Phillips. Seconder. Chief Philip Franks. Any questions? What? Any questions? Okay, any opposed? Okay. So there's no oppositions. Resolution, our motion is carried by consensus. Sorry, forgive me for that one. Moving forward with resolutions, we have two for the social. Resolution number 5, child and family reform. Therefore be it resolved, the General Assembly directs Indigenous Services Canada to fully implement the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal orders and eliminate racial discrimination against First Nation children without further delay. Further be it resolved, the General Assembly directs Indigenous Services Canada to immediately release the member nation's 2018-2019 immediate relief prevention funding as outlined by the Chiefs of Ontario Special Chiefs Assembly Resolution 1722, immediate relief prevention funding. Further be it resolved, the General Assembly directs the Indigenous Services Canada to provide support and capacity for the AIAI to take proactive role in the ongoing processes and discussions on policy and funding reform of First Nations child and family services in Ontario. Finally, be it resolved, the General Assembly directs the Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada to provide support and capacity for the member nations of the AIA in preparation and in the implementation of policy and funding reform of First Nation child and family services in Ontario. Moved by Chief Denise Stonefish, Delaware Nation, seconded by Councillor Catherine Wilson, Hiawatha First Nation. So any comments from the mover or the seconder? Seeing none, any comments from the delegates? One question, Chief Dean Sayers.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for that presentation. I'm wondering about the interpretation of the resolution, and I think there might be enough liberal interpretation space there to be able to accommodate, I'm hoping, the Jordan's principal navigators in each community. I'm finding there are concerns with the level of cooperation, and I don't think it's a surprise to us that there would be some concerns around cooperation with the federal government and being able to fund what is deemed as important for our youth and our children's growth. So I'm hoping if it's not incorporated, that the association can incorporate that into their plans, and when they do go to the table for funding, that we try to secure enough funding for navigators in each community. And if there's something more that maybe we could do at Chiefs Council, maybe prepare a resolution at Chiefs Council to maybe further move this resolution along that's aligned with that, that would be appreciated. But I did want to make that comment. We are challenged with some of the Jordan's Principles issues back home. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Actually, that's sort of a discussion that we did have just prior to the assembly, I think, with the Chiefs Council. I don't think you're on that particular call, but that is a discussion that we had regarding our Jordan's Principal Navigator has sort of turned into a service provision and dealing with clients a lot more, and so we sort of envisioned her to be more the coordinator / navigator. So that's something that we're going to be pushing for, is for workers, Jordan's Principal workers for each community, and our Jordan's Principal person can be more of gathering up unresolved issues and helping to push those through. And so that's sort of where we see things heading, and that's something we're definitely going to work towards. Yeah.
Miigwech for your, oh, one more question. Chief Stonefish?
So is the resolution that we have in the package, resolution number 4, totally different, or does that have the potential to capture Chief Sayre's concerns?
I don't even see number 4. I have number 5 and number 3.
Which one is number 4?
Oh, this is Jordan's principal, it's over here.
Okay, we have one of George's principal. Okay. No, I don't have it. Yeah. I was thinking if we can address this when it comes to the Hassab issues. But we can work out, you know, I think this is sort of covers that off in there. And under the first, therefore be it resolved, Chief. So when we get to the Hassab, maybe we can address this resolution then. Yeah. So we're talking about this first resolution, right?
So I gotta call for a vote. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the resolution is carried by consensus. There is a second resolution, resolution number 6, remoteness quotient. Therefore, be it resolved, the General Assembly recognizes the importance of Nishwanan development of remoteness quotient and is supportive of its intent to address the remote Northern First Nation communities' realities of high costs of living and providing services in those communities. Further be it resolved, the General Assembly asserts prior to any application of remoteness quotient, the remoteness quotient study needs to be completed, followed by a review and acceptance of the final results of the study by Ontario First Nation leadership. Further be it resolved, following the acceptance of the remoteness quotient study, the General Assembly asserts that 1, further discussion on its implementation are required between First Nation leadership in an ongoing and future First Nation child and family service reform, and that any application of the remoteness quotient needs to be implemented in a manner that is over and above current and future funding allocations. Finally, be it resolved, the General Assembly directs INAC, Indigenous Services Canada and Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada to make it into consideration the unique needs and socioeconomic realities of AIA as member nations, and to provide funding that is based on substantively equality, and to work with member nations on addressing these needs and realities in order to improve service delivery and the well-being of their communities. Moved by Chief Denise Stonefish, Delaware Nation, and seconded by Chief Lori Carr, Hiawatha First Nation. Is there any comments from the movers or the seconder? Chief Stonefish?
I just think that the resolution basically speaks for itself, but I think you've heard throughout today the concerns about the non-release of the funds that are not coming to the communities as a result of the funding. So I think that despite that the remoteness quotient study is going on, it shouldn't be holding up any potential funding that comes to the communities. And that being said, we do understand and we do appreciate the fact that northern communities experience higher costs, but it still should not be used as a way to stop any allocations coming to the rest of the communities, especially for our children.
Miigwech. Any other comments from delegates?
If I could just maybe add one, sorry, is that that's something we did address with the RDG yesterday, and so she is convinced that it will be released fairly soon, although we are going to be proceeding with some media regarding the issue. And part of the issue is how the federal government releases their funding to release the fixed pot based on nothing in particular that we can determine. And they say, go ahead, and it's like throwing a piece of bread between some seagulls. You know how that is. They're all kind of getting there squabbling and squawking. And so we'd rather see, funding that's needs-based. You have X amount of kids based on how much a child in Ontario receives. Here's how much, your community would need based on need. And that, therefore, you're going to be getting away from, here's a fixed pot divided behind 133, and we realize you have remoteness, we realize you have larger First Nations, you have more population. Oh, here's this one for a smaller one, you're not so remote, but you still might have slightly higher cost. And so your formulas get crazy. So if you have to change that funding approach at the federal level is really what it is. Instead of having fixed pots of money that they just kind of pluck the number out of thin air and say, here you go. And the CHRT decision is about substantive equality, and that's got to be based on needs and based on being equal with the other kids received throughout the province. And that's, we have to change that.
Chief Miracle?
My understanding, the Northern Quotient study is not finished. We've not seen any information on it. So what formula has the RDG going to use to distribute this money? The one recommended by the chiefs or some other formula?
It's not really up to her. It's not being held up by her. It's being held up by the Minister Philpott at this point. So that's where we have to apply the pressure.
So there's no indication what formula is going to be used to allocate the money?
Well, the only thing we told her is that there's the OFNLP formula. The Chiefs and Assembly agreed to it for last year. For this year, the remoteness quotient is not complete yet, and it's not going to be. We don't know exactly when that is, and we can't afford to wait to find out when it's going to be done. We need that money now. That was our message.
So you'll be organizing a meeting with Jane Philpott then?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comment? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Seeing none, the resolution is carried by consensus. Is it taxation now?
Yeah. Or we could have a quick break if you want to.
What?
Yeah, might as well take 15.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, a quick 15-minute break. Next up on the agenda is taxation after return, so we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes. Get some fresh air.
Somebody's found a pair of glasses.
Has,
They're in a gray case.
okay, has anybody found a pair of glasses? They're in a gray case. They belong to Deputy Grand Chief Gord Peters, so if you find them, bring them on up.
I know you're out there, I can hear you.
Worked for me that day.
That's why I say we need a break. We need a bum break.
Oh, Valentina? Okay, so just something from there? Okay. Good. Number two? Okay. No, that's not how branded.
Huh?
No, that's not how branded.
Who is that? Why?
Trust me. Ready?
Yeah.
There we go. And the winning number is...
13 principals. Kristen, not cheating. Oh, employees
Okay,
can't win.
Well, boys can't win?
Employees.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so that one's out.
Okay.
Okay. Here we go again. And the winner is
16. Susan.
Barber Stock. Okay, cool. Okay. Hello. Hello. We have drawn the winning number for the medallion, and the winner is Susan Barberstock. Susan Barberstock. You have 3 seconds to make it to the front, or it will go to someone. Congratulations. Here's a lovely little medallion. Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
send it, don't even bother to send it back. Send it back. I said that you're really disappointed that this is now you put the project in jeopardy. Send it back, send this one back to Don, I'll send it back. It can't be nice to these people. You're not going to fund us. Don't stop this game. You know, absolutely. But you gotta be tough. You gotta be tough on these people. Helping them with things that help people. I will be there on this day. You have to stop. If you don't try to stop it, they do that when they're playing a game when they're trying to stretch it out for the Yeah, we should have done more. I should have done more. I think one of them candidates took my I don't know. Candidates for honor.
We do have some flexibility on the
Again.
They do for positions, so you always give them kind of a choice who they want to speak. Some will speak first, and they do.
Okay, I'd like to reconvene in about 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. Tell them it's in their bag, probably. Okay.
Piece pie. Piece cake.
Okay.
Piece of
Well,
something.
you can take mine for distribution because I know what's in it already, right? Oh, okay.
in our time frame right now.
So there's no resolutions on taxation, correct? And then there's this one on health, that one on health. There's two on health here.
I think so, yeah.
And elder
Which
support.
ones are elder supports?
Yeah, I don't know where elder supports goes.
That would go in there as well.
Okay. And this one too, this other health one. So there's four.
Okay, which ones do you have?
Okay, so I have number 4, which is Jordan's principal. Well, I should probably
three.
start with number 3, which is elder support.
Four.
And there's number 2. So these two, like, they go together, or are they the same thing? This was passed.
Okay, these are done. I don't think I have all of them, but you have them, right?
There's 4.
Okay.
I'm just gonna, should I just go ask Jeff?
Yeah, just make sure that we have them all. Yeah, in 1 minute. T minus 1 minute.
After that, I kind of fuzzy.
So you know about that Chief Phillips is going to be speaking really quickly first about.
No, I don't.
Okay, all right, I'll introduce him then.
Okay, yeah, you do that part, please. Thank you.
All right.
Okay, this the top one? Okay, I'll just take this one. So I don't get confused. Thank you. Where'd you didn't leave them?
I had them on, and then I came back here.
Okay, I'd like to call the meeting back to order.
I came to congratulate them all. And I think I put my glass.
And just so you know, we may be shuffling 1 or 2 items to tomorrow, just so we can so we don't have to stay till 5 or 6 or anything tonight. We want to finish at a reasonable time today. Before we continue on, Chief Phillips wanted to come up and present something on behalf of Oneida Chief and Council. And since Chief Carr somewhat waxed poetic about Chief Phillips' retirement from politics, I'd also like to mention too about the positive influence that Chief Phillips has. In negative, he's also been a negative influence, but just kidding. No, he's been mostly good. But I learned a lot from the guy, and I really don't believe he's going to retire. He's probably going to come back at some point in some capacity, and then with something to do with politics. He just can't stay away, I don't think. But anyway, without further ado, Chief Phillips does have an announcement to make for all the delegates, and so I'll let him do it.
So go this way, everybody, can you hear me? Jeff, is there anybody outside? Tell them to come on in or open the door, then they can hear me from there. Good afternoon, everybody. What I want to do is, on behalf of the United Nation of the Thames, Chief and Council and our community, is to give you a little special gift. We've had a community member that has been involved in creating their own business, some natural products, natural stuff. Anyways, we asked them to see whether or not they would be kind enough to put together a gift package for you, and this is exactly what they're doing. So this is our appreciation for you taking the time to come down and visit our community, come down and taking the time to enjoy our community, and we want you to leave with a good feeling. We're glad to be the hosts of the AIA Annual General Assembly, and this is just our way of saying thank you very much for coming, and I hope that you enjoy our stay here in Oneida, and that you'll remember that we are friendly people, we're accommodating people, and that, and as other people said before, a gift is the best way in terms of showing our appreciation. So, on behalf of the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and retiring chief, our community, and all of the people that have helped today behind the scenes and everything else like that, we just want to say thank you. Now, once we get that done, what I'd like to do again, and I thank the Grand Chief and the delegation for their indulgence, is what I'd like to do is ask the Grand Chief, the Deputy Grand Chief, and the AIAI staff also to line up here, because we also want them to share in terms of these gifts as well. We wouldn't have this if it wasn't for that organization. We wouldn't be here, and we certainly wouldn't be here without all the work that you've seen go behind the scenes. As a policy analyst, I know how much work goes behind the scenes. You only see the end of the tip in terms of this written report that's in front of you. So without any, I guess, any more, Grand Chief, could I get you, Deputy, and your staff to line up in front of us so that we can acknowledge you, please? I don't see your staff moving there, Grand Chief, so. So if we can, Oneida, if we could bring up some gifts up front. Can we bring some gifts up front for our AIAI staff? That's all right, that's all right. And again, once again there, ladies and gentlemen, I want to take this time to thank the Grand Chief, thank the Deputy Grand Chief for all the work that they've been doing, and behind the scenes, thank all of his staff. This staff is, some of them are new, some of them have been there for a long time, but we've depended on them for years. So I just want to take this time and please join me for a nice little congratulations to AIAI staff and then honor them. Good. And for those AI staff that didn't get any gift, oh well. Oh well.
Chief, where's mine?
Catherine,
I was kidding.
our co-chair.
Hot. There we go. What? I'm so happy.
I get a bigger one.
Chief, really good.
Okay, did I get one? Ellie, did you get yours? Grand Chief, did they all get it? Okay, so just one last round of applause. Thank you very much, AI. And now back to your regular programming. Regular scheduling program.
For some reason, I got shampoo in mine. I'm just kidding. I don't. Okay, let's go to our co-chair.
So coming in after the break, our next presentation is about taxation, delivered to you by Chief Philip Franks and Deputy Grand Chief Peters. Taxation touching upon bilateral relationships, tobacco and cigar taxation, and AAA tobacco research project resolutions. So I'll hand the floor over to them. Chief Phillips.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And I too had spoken on the microphone yesterday, asking a question, I believe it was, and I should too say, on behalf of the WATA delegates and myself, we are glad to be here in the Oneida Territory and appreciate all your hospitality and gifts. We're doing taxation as I did last year. Tina's helping me to do this slide switching because I know I will mess it up. In general, since last year, I can't say we've come a long way with taxation, but we're still plugging away at it. So when you look at the priorities that were set in the by the Chiefs Council, over the past year, there have been several areas to focus on, and they include the advocacy against the bureaucratic and burdensome tax rebate, the gas tax rebate system, the advocacy for consistent and proper implementation of the point of sale exemptions, supporting our people from unfair tax bills and poverty caused by the OI leasing issue. That is something as well that was not your typical taxation issue that we've dealt with. Ensuring ensuring our inherent right to freely produce, sell, and manufacture tobacco is respected in all facets. Those are the priority areas and points of focus. The bilateral relationship that we got into through this relationship between AI and Ontario, the AI staff are attempting to secure a technical and political table with the Ministry of Finance. The purpose of the table would be to discuss the First Nations taxation immunity to create movements on the priority issues under this file. A letter of request was sent to the Ministry of Finance inviting them to establish a bilateral table for taxation, but to date there has been not a response to that request. And in December last year, a political leadership meeting with Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation took place, and ourselves. Our priority issues related to tax immunity were relayed to the minister and his senior staff. And I just, knowing that as we go forward, I know that with the new government we are going to really have to focus on this. The Ministry of Finance, and especially in the cigarette taxation area, we're pretty darn sure they were going to stay on top and beat us at this thing. That's the general feeling I got. They have strong feelings. That's not going to go away. It's not going to lessen any with the new government that we have coming in. So switching over to the OI leasing issue, the tax bills handed out to the people who were involved in the OI leasing have created significant and undue hardship for many, and we're working to find a solution for this. Recently, last month, Deputy Grand Chief met with Revenue Canada, and during this meeting it was determined that Revenue Canada has developed a process for dealing with OI bills. This process would be the direct result of the chiefs at the Ontario caucus speaking with the Minister of National Revenue about First Nation tax immunity as a priority and an inherent right. The process being implemented by Revenue Canada is specifically for cases where the taxation bill has caused significant hardship for the individual. There's criteria in place that only shows Revenue Canada to address cases involving people who make under $60,000 annually. So far, over 1,000 OI leasing cases have been identified as outstanding. Over 600 have been resolved. In certain special circumstances, if people have already paid their taxation bill, they can now submit to have their case reviewed. Cigars. Cigars has come up in the last year. In the last year, the ministry has begun efforts to thwart the First Nations cigar business. But I have to add, I don't think it's just been the last year. I was asking at home, and cigars there have been taxed at the distributor, at the wholesaler, probably going back into late 2016. We just didn't know about that. So, yeah, so that's what it is. The taxation is being applied to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler is telling the retailers, you know, you pay the tax because I pay the tax, and you try to get it back. The new approach by the finance. So Ontario has made it clear that reimbursements to retailers are going to be only provided for cigarettes sold to First Nation people on reserve. This is in following with the Ontario Tobacco Tax Act, and that one narrows our First Nations tax immunity to tobacco sold to status Indians on reserve only. The cigar initiative significantly impacts First Nation cigar retailers, minimizing cigar profit and potentially putting some businesses into jeopardy. A lawsuit has been launched against the government because of this. The claimants are asserting that the First Nation right to tax immunity in opposition of the Ontario Tobacco Tax Act. If the outcome of the case is negative, it could have significant impacts on all First Nation cigar and tobacco sales going forward. Currently, Quebec cigar distributors are waiting to see the outcome of the lawsuit. They are continuing to sell tax-exempt cigars to First Nation retailers for the time being. Slide 6, is it? Hang on, what have I done? Oh, yeah, sorry. You know what's really hard? When you've got cataracts, and you used to be able to not see close up, but now you can't see close up. And then it's going to reverse again. I won't be able to see, like I will have to do this. I'm in that mid stage, so bear with me. So the position of the AGA Chiefs Council remains unchanged. All of the work on the tobacco file supports our inherent right and jurisdictional authority to freely trade, sell, and manufacture tobacco products and to be free of taxation. That's all we've been saying. The other portion of this were the legislations that came into effect, the Ontario Tobacco Tax Act, which talks about labeling tobacco as contraband, about growing, having to go to them to grow tobacco, our tobacco. The cigarette allocation system, we already have been dealing with that for quite a long time, and it micromanages and narrows our economic development, and that economic development has grown in the last few years. It's not the time to take it away. The federal act, the C-10, this has all got to do with criminalizing us. What else can we say? Again, it's talking about contraband. It's establishing fines, and not just fines, they're like good big fines, and jail. And then, of course, federal excise taxes that have been on everything. This has always been one that's infringing on our right to tax immunity. Of all the things that are excise taxes applied to, we don't see any of it. I believe they say it's not really a tax, something like that. So when in the criminalization of our inherent rights, government legislation has real and very negative impacts on our communities. This is what we've been saying. Our communities and our economy. The tax legislation and policies encourage poverty, threaten our local economies, and perpetuate negative stereotypes that harm our people every day. It's just not right. The government penalizes our people for exercising our rights. It's not right they continue to attempt to assert their jurisdiction in our territories. It's not right that they're trying to knock back the economies that have just started taking off. They're not the only economy we have, but they are very significant. And I think we'll find out more about that. So we talk about updates. We, if you recall, in the 2016 fiscal year, the government amended the Ontario Tobacco Tax Act to allow the Minister of Finance to enter into agreements with First Nations. The Ministry of Finance then began approaching First Nations regarding tobacco resource revenue sharing agreements. When we were approached, the AI Chiefs Council were given a presentation, given information, and we rejected that tobacco resource revenue sharing framework. It did not take into account or consider the inherent rights and would serve to jeopardize First Nation businesses. Those were our first points that we talked about. Over the past year, some progress has been made on the tobacco file through the AI Tobacco Economic Research Project. And the next portion of our presentation will be specifically on that, and Deputy Grand Chief Peters will be coming up to do that. Bit of a presentation. I just wanted to say one more thing. I got to tell you a story when I think about this tax stuff. And to some people, some people find it offensive, but it goes back when I heard it, because the person that told it found it humorous. I've always found it kind of a little bit of a humorous story. Chief Lila Chief Lila came back from town one time to a meeting we were having this goes back probably 25 years ago. And she was kind of laughing. She said, "I just came back from the doctor's." And when I was in the doctor's, in the waiting room, there was a mother with a young child, and the child, being rambunctious, was getting all over. So she had one of those reading books, and she would say, "What does the dog say?" And of course the kid goes, "Bow wow." "What does the cat say? What does the cow say?" And somehow the thing comes up and it goes, "And what does the Indian say?" I don't know what the proper answer was supposed to be, but the kid went, "No tax." Honestly, that's what she told us. This is like in the early 90s, right? So you could get really kind of ticked off about that, about what these people are teaching their children. Or you could find it humorous. But now, all this time later, I find it kind of funny, because now as we approach dealing with the new government, we can go to Toronto and we say, "Mr. Ford, your children knew 25 or 30 years ago what you're doing through your Ministry of Finance is just wrong. Your children knew no tax way back then." So that's what we can do. So yeah, we move on, and there was some stuff going on with the research project. And here's Gordon to take over that portion.
Thank you, Chief Franks, for the overall report, and specifically I'm going to address the taxation one that's before us. We already saw the federal government's law on C-10, where they called everything contraband, but what they did was they incorporated the province by reference, and then the province passed the Ontario Raw Leaf Act, which gave them entrance into our communities. It's a standard practice that these governments have been using for a while, because technically the provincial government doesn't have any jurisdiction in our communities, but that's how they get into our communities. So what happened after all these acts were passed, they start putting pressure on our communities. And so they came in and they started to audit. They audited some of the stores. They have a level that they say has been in place for a long time about how much stores can make before they have to pay taxes and stuff. So they started an auditing process. They started to audit gas stations for how much gas they sell and how much of that gas is sold to the Canadian public and not to our communities. And so that pressure started this process of dialogue that we have with the Ontario government. Chief Frank said we rejected Ontario's offer, what they put on the table, because basically what they wanted to do is they wanted us to tax our people, and they wanted us to take a share of the revenue to offset that. Now we go back to our businesses. But as this goes on, we were given directions to be able to find out how we might be able to approach this, and so this is what I want to talk about today. So you'll see our introduction. Of course, we've always said this, so I'm going to go right to the next slide. I'm going to talk about the Economic Research Project. So what we did was that we started to look at what was the impact and role of tobacco in our communities. And so when we started this project, it was kind of difficult. You know, we always thought tobacco was an economic driver in our community, but we never knew what level that was going to be or how it was going to play out. And so when we started this discussion with people, there wasn't a lot of interest in being able to move on this issue. We did in phase one, we started in September, we went to the end of March. Our lead researcher was Michelle Altman. We had community liaisons who helped us with dialogue in the communities. We had Dean Dockstader from the Oneida Nation. We had Mallory McCormick from Batchewana, Vil Manoa from the Delaware Nation, and Tracy Miracle from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte. Our overall objective was to understand the extent of the tobacco industry and its impact on our economic well-being in the community. And so we set out to do some research and some analysis and trying to figure out what we needed to be able to do. Click. This, you'll see, is a little schematic of what it is that we were trying to do, people that were in place. We started out by being able to do, on our own processes, we started to look at community profiles. And so in there, we found that a number of communities have, for instance, they have business directories to tell you what businesses operate in the community. Some have their own processes where they give vendors permits, and so there's a variety of things. So we wanted to look at what our businesses were owned, any that were owned by the communities, and any that were owned by individual members. So when we looked at this, our research project, we looked at the legislation, we looked at taxation, the economic impacts, employment skills, barriers and gaps, community and business supports, and tobacco products and pricing. So I think the preliminary findings begin to speak for themselves when we look at it and saying, we have a large entrepreneurial spirit in our community. You know, we have a lot of business people in our community, you know, and they have a real strong I guess it's a reminder that they are out there doing business. They would like to be able to ensure that there are no more economic problems that they face. They would like to be able to look at how they play a role within the context of the community on a greater basis. So our data collected system shows that that tobacco does play a significant role. And so what we did in our research was we committed to each of the councils, each of the communities, that we would not publish their information. That we would come back and we would go through that information with them, and they would be able to release what they wanted to be able to release. But here's what our tobacco project said. We said in terms of businesses, of our communities, tobacco-dependent businesses are 72. They employ 333 people. Those wages are about $6.9 million. A tobacco-dependent business is a business that does other things but sells tobacco. But it is dependent on being able to do the sale of tobacco in order to be able to continue to thrive. Tobacco retailers that sell direct tobacco, nothing else, it was 21. They employ 200 people. The wages were about $3.9 million. So that total in our communities of 93 businesses, they employ 533 people at $10.8 billion was the amount of money that gets circulated in our communities. And to do economies, we know very clearly that in order to build economy, money needs to circulate in the community. So somebody gets paid here, needs to buy something over here, that needs to be able to buy something over there. They say that money needs to circulate 7 times in the community to be able to have an economy. So we see most of our economies, most of the times in our communities, maybe we have 3, maybe 4 at best as we're moving forward. So with this information in hand, we did not, as I said, we sent some amalgamated information back to Ontario about this particular phase. We started to talk about a second phase of what might be able to be done in the second phase. In that second phase, we said that our objective has been the same, is to be able to look at that increase in the well-being of our families and the economic strength of our communities. That process never changed from the beginning. So here's the second phase. And what they said to us, because they keep telling us about Akwesasne's model and Chippewa's model on how to move forward. And then as we start talking about this one day, they said to us, because we were talking about this in the context of a jurisdictional process, and we don't want them to go through a process where they recognize our laws, because they don't have the authority to be able to recognize our laws. And so we start talking about a NAFTA-like agreement. And so in the context of a NAFTA-like agreement, you never discuss anybody's jurisdiction. What you sort out is the trade and the commerce. And so if we do lawmaking, that's the general direction that we would go. So our second phase would look at those kinds of issues that we would like to be able to address. We're looking at a lawmaking summit because regardless of where we end up with this project, lawmaking is something that we should all be looking at and looking forward to and trying to see. One of the things that we did say was that we would meet with the Ontario government in the leadership summit to talk about what this process is going to end up with. We wanted to do a campaign strategy. One of the things that our chief said to us clearly in the beginning, that revenue sharing wasn't enough. That one of the things that had to happen was that it was like a loss of use of our economy, tobacco. And if we were going to make that an economy as we're moving along, then there's a loss of use to that. It's not just going forward sharing revenue, there's something that has to be done going backwards as well. So we'll continue to expand the dialogue between chiefs and councils and the entrepreneurs to find ways of being able to support, control, authority, and jurisdiction. And we're looking at it in the context of this NAFTA-style agreement, and I'll show you what it looks like. Where we end up, don't know. This may die right where we are today without going any further. But because of the election process, and we don't know what's going on because we never signed a second TPA with the Ontario government. They got into a hassle at the end of the day, and that's as far as they went. So if it dies here, the good part is that we have economic research in our community. We will share that with your communities. You will know what it is, and you will know that your businesses want to be able to figure out how to work with you as chiefs and councils in order to be able to regulate the business. That much we know for sure at this point in time. So that's all I can tell you about phase 2. It may or may not happen. If it does happen, we probably won't see anything occur until probably the fall after this government goes through its transitional work. So, thank you very much.
Any questions or comments for Deputy Grand Chief Peters or Chief Franks? Seeing none, a motion is required to accept the update on taxation as presented by Chief Franks and Deputy Grand Chief Peters. Harvey? Oh, Harvey.
Yeah, Harvey Bell, Batchwala. I didn't hear that word. That last meeting I was at an OI session, and it's in regards to like a forgiveness, and I forget the word, but I didn't hear it today. And I was wondering if there was going to be any more. There was some figures said like 6,000 had been settled of those 1,000 cases. And does that mean that they were made to pay? I think that's the interpretation. And but I didn't hear any further development on.
There were over 1,000 cases at OI leasing, well over 1,000, actually more than 1,100. What happened as that court case finished with the OI leasing, the federal government immediately went into collections after they lost it. They went, I don't know how far they went, if they went to the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court. So many people started to pay on their own because they were getting harassed, and if you're living in a city, if you own any property, anything, they were threatening to take your house, your property, or whatever, eh? So people started to make provisions to be able to do that. So we had tried some time ago to start a process. We were trying to get a remission order. We were not successful in being able to get that remission order. And then about a year or so ago, we started the process with them. It was actually the second process that we started with them. And then it picked up speed. And so a lot of people in the process have been dealt with. There's over 300 that are left. The reason we got back involved in it was because we had some people from our communities asking if we were going to deal with some of the OAI taxation issues. So we met with Revenue. They are amenable to the process. As I said this morning, or yesterday morning, the coup process stopped. They fired the people that were handling the process. So one of them was Nathan. He was involved, John Tesh, and there was another lady, Sydney Oaks, that was involved in the process. So coup's process stopped. So we said to them, if they don't restart, we'd like to be able to take that over and like to be able to figure out how we start to solve some of those issues for our people as well, communities as well.
Yeah, I'd like to see something be developed to try and help those people. I had mentioned at that meeting that a lot of those people were single parents, single moms or single dads, trying to make a go of it in the city. And they were caught up in that process of OI. And those are the ones that have suffered or are still suffering as a result.
There is a process already established, Harvey. We just need to re-kick the process to get it going again, and that's what we're in the process of doing. Don?
In December at the AFN meeting, Isidore was there, and he asked if we would take charge of the file and meet with the Minister of Finance on this OI leasing issue, because he had to duck out to go somewhere else. And I don't know, was Chief Dean Sayers was there at the time? And the Minister of Finance was there. She barely could speak any English, so we did ask about the remission order, but there had been some people from my own community that they were going to seize their property, their bank accounts, their pensions, and that still is the status of it. They're still after them for the money. What the minister said is they could forgive the interest, but the debt itself would have to be repaid. And so has there been any written correspondence from the minister or any letters sent to the minister to unanswered?
The requirement for working with this and what was in place and which we're continuing on with is that it's about hardship. If you make less than $30,000, they will eliminate not only the penalties and interests that are there and everything, but they will eliminate that tax portion as well. If you make less than $60,000, they will get rid of the penalties and interests and everything, and they'll work with you on what that hardship actually is to see what parts of that can be done and what other arrangements can be done. That's as far as the process as I understand and know it. I don't know what they're prepared to do with people if they make $60,000 a year. All I know is that that hardship extends to $60,000, and that's what they're willing to work with.
Yeah. So how much of their income can they seize? I know they can't take it all. Does the Wage Guarantee Act apply to this? Like, I think it's 40% or something they can seize under a garnishment order?
In a garnishee order, I think what they do in a garnishee order is they begin to be able to, you make payments the same way based on your income, and you continue to make those payments. And if you retire, they'll still garnishee your pension, and they will also garnishee your Canada pension.
But can they take it all is the question.
No, they cannot take it all. No.
Okay.
Miigwech Chiefs, is there any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'm looking for a mover and a seconder to accept the update on taxation as presented by Chief Franks and Deputy Grand Chief Peter.
Just one other question, Gord. Did OI have insurance? Because if he was leading people to believe that everything was in order with this OI leasing, is there any liability that his insurance policy should be addressing?
I think they've already investigated that, some of the members who were part of the process. I also believe that they also sued OI already too as well. I think there's a lawsuit against them as well. So I think the well is dry over there. Most of the monies that they utilized were to go to the court action.
But the whole mess really hinges on the portability of our rights to be earn tax exempt income in our traditional territory. And that's the real political relationship issue that's not addressed.
Yes, I agree with you there.
Okay, last time, I'm looking for a mover and a seconder to accept the update on taxation as presented by Chief Franks and Deputy Grand Chief Peters. Deborah Vincent. Seconder.
Blaine Commanded. Blaine Commanded. Yeah, say his name too.
Blaine Commanded. Did I say that right?
You need to ask them.
Any oppositions or abstentions? Seeing none, motion carried by consensus. So moving forward, next up we have a presentation by Grand Chief Joel Abram on health and wellness, touching upon the Health and Social Advisory Board, issue papers, Jordan Principle, the cannabis legislation, water report, a regional update on health, and we have some health resolutions to pass afterwards.
All right. Okay. Depending how things go, this may be the last presentation for the day. But yes. Or we can do some jumping jacks and then get enough energy to do one more. But no, we won't do that. Okay. Okay, Health Social Advisory Board. And as the title suggests, this is an AI board that deals with health and social issues and provides advice to the Chiefs Council and also to the General Assembly, making recommendations going forward in those respective areas. So this comprised basically of 3 reps from each community. There's usually a political rep and maybe a couple technical reps or some combination of that. And again, is responsible for those things, fulfilling mandates. We also get mandates from the General Assembly and the Chiefs Council through way of resolutions. Also, we have sharing information, best practices related to program and service delivery. So generally, we try to have a political advocate, someone from a health technician from each of the communities, and someone from somewhere in social. And so most communities are pretty good about doing that. And I also have to commend the HASA board members for their expertise, and they're very knowledgeable going in forward, and so the Real House have pretty good discussions and things going forward. So the HASA, we provide a unique opportunity. We come together to look at the current programs, new program ideas that are coming down the pipe, evaluating and plan services, policies, programs, and we share best practices with each other, and we also jointly problem solve on some of these things. Generally, here's the Chief Council portfolio holders for HASAB. Chief Miracle for Health, and Chief Phillips and Chief Carr are for Social. And the chair is myself, and the staff, again, is Brandy Cornelius, and she's around here somewhere. Oh, there she is. Brandy's over there, and she's the one that gives me the whip when I need to do something. And Suzanne, she grabs me by the ear. Tina, she's really nice and she's smart. Okay, there's Tina. Yes, and Zachariah, he makes me look good, apparently. That's what he says, yes, okay. And additional staff as required. So the staff all do really excellent jobs, I have to say, and make sure everything's ready to go for the most part. And we're always, I think, very progressive in terms of where we are with some of our issues. Okay, there were some updates with regards to the terms of reference. And the 2017-18 fiscal year, the HASAB terms of reference was amended to expand the position of chair, and the position was previously to be filled only by the AIAI Deputy Grand Chief, and the terms of reference was updated to open up the position to either Grand or Deputy Grand Chief, depending upon their preference in any direction from Chiefs Council upon taking up their positions in a political executive. So I was always really interested in a lot of the things in the health and social field, you know, child welfare and everything that's in there. And so obviously the Chiefs Council said that they agreed with that, and they agreed to amend the term of reference so I could do that. So we're also doing updates to include youth reps in the board's composition, and these are from AI Resolution 0115, entrenching and recognizing the value of our youth. And 216 is a youth resolution, and AI Youth Council terms of reference in a portfolio system. And as you saw, they did appoint a HASA board member from amongst themselves as well. So hopefully they'll be able to attend HASA board meetings from here on out if they're available to do so. We facilitate developments of a coordinated stance on critical policy issues, and these are documented in HASAB issue papers in our strategic plan, and we've kind of been updating that over the last little while as well. So here's the following policy areas: elders abuse prevention, elders housing and support care, mental health and addictions, environmental issues impacting health, community safety, safe drinking water, NIHB, non-insured health benefits, cancer care, housing, child welfare, and also cannabis legalization. And we've also, you know, one of the other things we do is develop issue papers in each of the priority areas in the strategic plan, and these are vital tools for advocacy and securing supports to advance solutions. They're living documents, which means we have to constantly update them, review them, because there's changing circumstances politically sometimes or program-wise, and maybe community priorities may change. So we have to change those documents as well. So starting this year, we also have a new process for updating and reviewing the issue papers in a strategic plan, so we've implemented that process as well. And it's very important for us when we need something quick and handy to go to do lobbying or advocacy work. And those things come in real handy for us because, as you know, you can't get change unless you can back up a lot of your documents with facts. Okay, some of the highlights. Indigenous Healing and Wellness Strategy. It's the new name of Oz. So I don't know how you'd say it now. IUS. But I don't know. Anyway, so we hosted a discussion with youth. That doesn't sound right. Okay, IHWS staff regarding performance and outcome measures, and that happened in January. We secured a commitment to have an AI specific table for programming to move away from the joint table. We did have one with the Union of Ontario Indians and Anishinaabe Aski Nation. And just was due to the lack of collaboration and diverging issues. We really have going in different issues, and we're, you know, too distinct, I think, you know. And so we wanted to have one, so because the other tables that have their own, they're kind of moving ahead a little bit more. So we thought it would be better to have an AIA specific one. So we had a meeting with the other two, and we broke their hearts. But anyway, so we said we're going to go our own way, guys. Sorry. But we have to do what's best for our AI communities. And yeah, Suzanne's smirking about it. Anyway, our terms of reference for the AI specific HWS table has been developed and reviewed by HASAB, still to be signed. So that's some of the work going on with that to move ahead on that. Another one area we have is elder abuse prevention training. Elder abuse prevention is one of the strategic priority areas of HASAB. And we did have that issue paper was presented, and a proposal for elder abuse prevention training. was developed and it was approved, and we did have the trainer session took place January 16th, 17th in collaboration with Elder Abuse Ontario, and a total of 27 frontline staff were trained, so that was quite an accomplishment. All participants were provided with takeaway tools to further enable information sharing and training. So I guess the idea of that, of course, as trainer, is that now that those people have been trained, they can also train others. And I don't know if those people can train others after that. Okay, but yeah, maybe they will. Okay, the board also provided direction to AIAI to organize a second round of training in 2018-19. Another area is caring for our seniors. The board has been very active in advancing the needs of seniors, and part of what we did over the past year was we developed a survey for seniors care, and it was completed in the nations, through the home and community care workers or congregate dining, whatever different programs you have to do. We did that. So there was about a bit over 550 surveys completed by seniors and caregivers, and a data analysis of the survey was completed and presented at the November 2017 HASAB meeting. And summary reports detailing the data were provided to HASAB and the Chiefs Council, and individualized reports were also provided to each nation. So some of the statistics that we're generating from that, we're going to use those again, and all important, you need those facts and statistics to advance your arguments. And so we're going to use those in our federal lobby documents, our issue papers, and our bilateral leadership presentations. And we also have developing a fact sheet and a poster, and that's going to be developed for the community so that they can use those. So let's take a quick look at some of the statistics. And before I get to statistics, a bit of lightheartedness, I guess. But anyway, my brother shared a statistic with me the other day. He said, I got some good news and bad news. And I said, what's the good news? He goes, well, I just read that about 50% of Indigenous people are overweight or obese. And I said, well, I'm one of them, and whatever. What's the good news? He goes, well, the other half are chubby chasers. So, but anyway.
What's your punchline? What did you say?
The other half are chubby chasers.
Are chubby what?
Chasers.
Chubby. Oh, got it.
I hate explaining jokes. Okay. I made it more funny than that. Anyway, okay. All right, let's go to the survey results. Survey says we asked 558 seniors, and 30% of them said, more serious note, that they do not feel safe in their communities. And one of the top reasons identified for this is fear or threat of abuse. And so that's part of the reason that we did do the trainer program on seniors abuse. We don't want that kind of stuff happening. And also that's going to be one of the stats that we use to hopefully get better policing in our communities as well. And almost a quarter of seniors indicated on a financial aspect that they're unable to afford living in their homes. And that's a really awful thing. So this really increases dependence and vulnerability, which directly elevates risk for elder abuse. So if they're going to have to depend on other people, then I guess that just heightens that chance that they may be abused. Less than 16% of seniors surveyed reported being in good health, which means that 84% of them have suffers from some sort of condition. So this is almost 4 times less than what it is across Canada. And so 56% of seniors over the age of 65 there report to be in good health. So that's very, very low compared to the general population. Over half of seniors surveyed who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder do not have sufficient access to spiritual, mental, emotional, or trauma-informed care services. And so again, this is going to be another stat that we can use to try to get some more of those supports in for our seniors, because that's something that's really needed. And especially for those, who may have suffered through residential schools and those kind of things, or, post residential school effects. And also over 40% of our seniors surveyed reported needing more access to traditional medicines, and that's along in the same lines, I think. That we want to make sure that we have those available for our seniors, whether it's a ceremony that they need done, or whether it's they need to see someone to talk, or whatever it is, they need traditional medicine. Almost 1 in 4 seniors does not have dependable access to safe drinking water, and a lot of that depends on where you live and whether or not your community has access to safe drinking water as well. So it was very revealing, and it just shows how much work has to be done when it comes to taking care of our seniors and what we have to do. And so it also speaks to some of the next steps that we have to think about. And for that is the board has provided direction for the upcoming year. So one of the things we want to do this upcoming year is really talk about the need for senior and elder supports in a community, including senior advocates and social workers. And so we want to pursue a relationship with the Ontario Minister of Seniors Affairs to optimize funding opportunities. And because our seniors are people too, and hopefully we'll have access to some of the same funding that's available to other seniors throughout the province. Another big need that was highlighted in the survey as well is the need for home renovation supports. A lot of seniors said that they do require renovations, and that's one of a big concern for them financially, is being able to afford that, so that their home is a safe place for them to stay. And we think that seniors, the longer they can stay in their home, the healthier and happier that they're going to be. And that's something that we need to take care of, is the Aging at Home initiative, and maybe getting more dollars for those kind of things, for supports so that they can do that, ramps and different kinds of doorknobs and whatever you need to do, widening doorways, wheelchairs accessible. And also we have to continue to support the long-term care task force to secure more long-term care bids in the communities. And I think Chief Miracle is going to speak a lot more on this later, so I'll leave a lot of that to him. We do have a long-term care home here in the community, which is always full. It provides 70 some odd jobs, a lot of good paying jobs, PSWs, there's nurses and those sorts of things. So it wasn't a smooth process getting it going by any means, but it is there now. And one of the positive things, I guess, now is that there's going to be more bids available, First Nation specific, because at the time when we got ours, there was no set aside. We had to argue even to be eligible to apply to get long-term care bids. And we ended up doing that under Minister Smitherman a few years back. So on a positive note, Tyendinaga, Mohawks Bay Quinte has been successful in securing a long-term care facility. Theirs is going to be big. So yeah, big props to Mohawks Bay Quinte. 128 bids will be coming soon to a Mohawk community near you. And they've also committed to working with Batchewana to fill information gaps. So I anticipate that Batchewana will also be awarded some long-term care bids, and probably in the next years, because they're going to be having bids available for every year for the next few years, First Nation specific. And I'm very looking forward to making a similar announcement for Batchewana for next year. And I'm pretty sure that's going to happen as well. And way to go. Next portion is safe drinking water. And I want to point this out here. This is something that we use for our federal lobby, which we did at the end of February. And you should all have it, but it was not in your binders. It was in the bags that you got. And I assume a lot of you left your bags in your rooms or something, or at home. And so just so you know, you do have a copy. We do have a few extras over here. You can see Shirley, she's got one. So if you do have a few extra copies, if anybody wants to get one. And so it kind of details a lot what the capital cost estimates are for each of the communities. And it's really good criticism of the federal government's priority, how they're going to prioritize water, or how they are prioritizing it. And I think right now they're just going after long-term care or long-term boil water advisories. If you've had a boil water advisory for over a year, then you're on their list to get looked at. But if you've been on a boil water advisory for less than a year, you're nowhere to be found, and there's no real process to address your situation. Not to mention all the water systems that are very close to being, having to go to boil water, or are near capacity, or don't meet current provincial water standards. So there needs to be, it's like having a police force and saying, we only have enough money for you to go after murderers. If somebody gets robbed or steals a car, you can't go after those guys. So it's sort of that similar situation where we really need to have all our concerns addressed with respect to water. And so that's a document that we used in our federal lobby, and it was somewhat successful, I think, because some of our communities have gotten a few things out of that. So what is the strategic priorities going to continue to be for the next little while? A water needs assessment was done by First Nation Engineering Services, and that's what the numbers that you see in this blue book here. And Deputy Grand Chief sort of spearheaded that, so he did a real good job. Also, Ontario Ministry of Environment and Climate Change presented to HASAB to provide information on provincial legislation regarding commercial water taking, water security, and the upcoming end to the water taking moratorium. So that's something that we're also very concerned about. Also, I did address the standing committee, and I don't know why they call them standing committees, they're all sitting, but it was on Federal Bill C-362, an act to amend the Department of Health Act, drinking water guidelines to raise First Nation water needs. And what that bill is about is basically about how the federal water drinking standards changes. And so, I just put in there, it must be nice to have standards and have support for those standards, because First Nations don't. And so I think they did take that message anyway. And I pointed out that Walkerton was not about having bad facilities. They had good facilities. They just had terrible workers that didn't know how to do their jobs. So a human resource capacity to actually run the plants is also another important component that they can't forget about. And we need investments for those good workers to be trained to know how to operate the water treatment facilities for those that have them, and to make sure that Walkerton things don't arise. But still, there's a lot of First Nations that don't even have facilities, and they're still relying on wells or bottled water in a lot of cases. Or they have to boil their water, so because of the facilities. So anyway, we could have multiple Walkertons if we all just chose to drink the water, I guess. Okay, in response to their water taking activities, HASAB is advocating a boycott on all Nestle water products. So if you have any of these brands next to you, hide them. I'm just kidding. We got Pure Life, Perrier, Montclair, and I never heard of this one, Aqua Panna. That's probably one of those really expensive ones, the fancy bottle. Okay. So I guess I can't drink Perrier and read poetry anymore. Anyway, okay. Relationship with Cancer Care Ontario. We have a direct relationship with Cancer Care Ontario advancing, and it's been advancing since the signing of an MOU that we had last year. And we had an issue paper presented to the Cancer Care Ontario for the development of a shared work plan. And also I was able to chair one of their meetings, or MC, what do you call it, one of their meetings last year in Chippewa of the Thames, and that was quite eye-opening and concerning about some of the issues within Cancer Care Ontario. So that's going to be important in terms of relationship building, research and surveillance, and screening, palliative and end-of-life care, education and awareness. And so I know a lot of people are concerned about an uptick in cancer rates, and not only in our community but everywhere. And so I think if we can have some research and surveillance on what those possible causes could be, then I think that would benefit everybody going forward. Next slide is a quick one on anti-human trafficking, another area of focus under the community safety strategic planning. And we did have an anti-trafficking forum for community workers and staff in December of this past year. to raise awareness of the growing issues and to improve response, identification, prevention, and support capabilities in the communities. And that's something that we're going to continue to look at, because we want to secure a person-year AI to focus on anti-human trafficking, to identify and help coordinate supports for the communities. And I don't know if there's going to be some more data involved in getting that, because at the end of the day, I think we want more direct supports right in the community to address human trafficking, because I think that's an issue not just here in Oneida. I know Chief Sayers has mentioned that in Batchewana. That's one of their big concerns, and I think everyone should be concerned about about that happening to a lot of our women and girls, and getting involved in that. And okay, our next portion is on a tripartite health system transformation. And so initial discussion and engagements are underway within AI member nations. And we just want to get feedback on how the government can improve the healthcare system for First Nations in Ontario. And I think, again, the election is probably going to change maybe how some of this rolls out. So we have to kind of, make sure that it's still going to happen. So, we did have engagements from Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, Indigenous Services Canada through ACU, and presentations from the Chiefs of Ontario staff were provided to HASA for feedback, and there were some sessions held in AI communities. So we're in the process of securing a health transformation lead to help facilitate discussions and provide relevant information, complete research, and carry out an AI-specific engagement process within the member nations. Because a lot of the health has now been mandated to go through the province. So we have the LINs, we have that current structure, and then we have our local areas that we have to deal with, and how did they deal with First Nations, how are concerns being addressed through the LINs, and all those sorts of things. So I think this is going to be an important process moving forward, and how we start to address some of our health issues. Child welfare. This is one of the reasons I got involved, and some of you have heard this before, but I first became involved in child welfare when I was a child. and I asked my parents if I was adopted, and they said, no, we couldn't find anyone that wanted you. But, okay, it's a bad joke. All right, anyway. So, the AI Family Revitalization Working Group, we initiated discussions on the types of changes needed for the communities to better support children and families. And so a lot of these discussions, we have a child welfare jurisdictional discussion paper, and it's designed to spur further internal discussions on child welfare for the member nations and document the position of the nations. So the HASAB approved and supported the discussion paper on March 6th of this year. And so what we want to do is to help you to take control and jurisdiction of your child welfare within your communities, because the government's not gonna, you can't rely on a government to do that. And part of the joint commitment that we heard from the feds and the province is that where First Nations have laws and processes regarding child welfare, that's going to take precedence over any kind of legislation. And so again, that's something that they're echoing what we've been trying to say, I think, in a lot of ways, is that where we have laws, it's going to supersede yours. And if they're going to agree with it for once, then I think that's fine, as long as it's not under their framework, I guess, right? But so I think that's something that we have to do, is occupy the field and get it done. So on the reform engagements, Stephen Van Lofeld of Van Lofeld Consulting has been contracted to engage member nations on that particular issue, child welfare reform and jurisdiction. So it'll have an opportunity for service providers and community members to receive information about and provide input into the AI position around child welfare reform. Yeah, so there's that one. Our next one is environmental issues impacting health. We had an AI climate change symposium. Over 60 participants attended, so it was very well attended. And we're in the process of securing a staff person dedicated to the environment file. And I think that's going to be in a very important position moving forward, because there is a lot of funds available right now through Ontario's climate change funding, Green On, and there's different ones. So we want to get research funding for ecosystem rebuilding through Ontario and help build First Nation connections with local municipalities. And just like you saw, London, City of London had One River meeting here yesterday at the end. And we also want to advocate solutions for nuclear waste. And I know that we don't want it near the Great Lakes, this is where it was proposed to go, right? But at the same time, right now they're basically sitting near the reactors and giant swimming pools, and they've been collecting there pretty much since the nuclear reactors have been going. And so you know that the half-life of these radioactive materials vastly exceeds any of ours. You know, we're talking tens of thousands of years before they degrade into non-active components. So they're going to stay dangerous, very dangerous for a long, long time. And so it's imperative that, you know, either we find other solutions for energy besides nuclear, or we find a good solution for nuclear waste. But, you know, I don't know of any government that's lasted tens of thousands of years that can maintain a facility that's going to keep these materials safe. So, you know, anyway, try to find some solutions for that. Our next item is mental health and addictions. I'm not going to go through all of these ones, but it is another strategic priority. We have an AI Youth Coordinator who is supporting and revitalizing AI Youth Council. And also the board continues to support the achievement as culture, youth-specific and male-specific services, community development and capacity building, training, wage parity, traditional healer services, and resources to support professional assessments. Also, we're looking at the prevention and reduction of impacts of cannabis legalization, infrastructure needs, including housing needs, second stage housing and housing for full circle of care services, and for those addressing addiction issues, and health infrastructure needs like health centers. Also, life promotions funding and additional youth and transition workers in the South, and increase access and elimination of gaps for mental health and addiction services. So I think the youth did mention about the one center being located in Thunder Bay specifically for the North, and that is something that we have a concern with, because we also have youth down here, you know, and that, you know, we also need those kind of supports in the South. So that's something that we have to follow up on. And we're going to have another HASAB meeting this summer, so we're going to have more specific tactics to look at these specific items at that particular meeting. Okay, NIHB, non-insured health benefits. So we did meet with the Minister of Indigenous Services advisors to bring forward concerns around NIHB and Jordan's principal application. And I believe that was, we met with one of the deputy ministers. And we also have a letter to Indigenous Services raising higher level outstanding issues on NIHB program implementation. And our outstanding concerns were documented and forwarded to Ontario Region for a response. We also had a conference call with Heather Larson to look at some of those outstanding concerns that we've documented that happened April 4th. So we secured a commitment to have a conference call with the board regarding medical transport, and have a full-day meeting with HASAB and other relevant community staff on outstanding NIHB issues. So that's a positive that we're going to have that commitment to look at what our concerns are and how we can address those. So I guess our next step is to have that full-day meeting and to monitor the national review progress and any of those final recommendations. Okay, we're almost at the end now. And cannabis legalization. We hosted an AI cannabis legalization forum of February of this year. We had 70 on day one and 60 people on day two. And a lot of it was just to kind of inform what we can know about the legislation, some educational resources provided to the participants, and also there was networking opportunities for own sessions in the communities, and an educational video being developed for the communities. And again, I guess the thing to recognize is that just like, you know, every, you know, First Nations in Ontario, there's a lot of different varying opinions on where people are with respect to that. And AI is no different. Member nation may have a different attitude than another and another. So I think we just have to respect those differences and find where we are common and advocate for those particular issues and also for individual community needs. So Chiefs Council met with Parliamentary Secretary Bill Blair. It was during our federal lobby and to forward concerns with the legislation's development and implementation. And again, I'm not going to discuss the lack of support. It is a major concern, but that's already been covered today around what we are and are not getting through that, and it's something that we'll continue to address. All right, so that's Hassab, and I'd like to thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, Suzanne and Brandy are over there. I'm just kidding. No, I'll try to answer. Okay, so I tried to be as thorough as I could without trying to read verbatim, but anyway, so there's no questions then? Okay.
Since there's no questions, I'm going to look for a mover and a seconder to accept Chief Grand Joel Abrams' health and wellness presentation. Councillor Harvey Bell, mover, seconder, Chief Miracle. Any oppositions? Abstentions? Seeing none, motion is carried by consensus. What about all these? Do we do those at the end?
Maybe at the end, yeah.
So next up we have Chief Donald Miracle from the Mohawks Bay of Quinte presenting on the regional health update.
I bring greetings from the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte to all the members of the Assembly gathered here today, and I want to extend my congratulations on the retirement of Chief Randall Phillips. Wish him the best in all his future endeavors, and bring greetings to the people of Oneida, and thank you very much for your excellent hospitality that you've given us today. I want to thank the executive of AIAI and all of the AIAI staff who worked on all these issues, and particularly the ones who work on health, an issue that's so important to our people. So the report that I'm going to give you is pretty much a regional perspective. We were able to make some progress in the area of long-term care. A year ago in May, Grand Chief Pat Madabi, who was our chair of the Chiefs Committee on Health, met with Sharon Lee Smith and the Deputy Minister of Long-Term Care and her staff, and Brian Pollard, who does licensing for long-term care. At that time, we posed the question, what is in the plan to deal with the backlog in long-term care, and specifically for First Nations people? And the answer we got was there is no plan. So we brought to we had a discussion about it, that there needed to be a First Nations strategy and accommodation in the allocation of any new beds that the province might allocate. So the outcome of that was there was a resolution from the Chiefs of Ontario to strike a Chiefs Committee. I volunteered to sit on that committee, and there was representation from all of the PTOs, and it was an example of how the chiefs from the north and the south could work together. And so the outcome of that was there was 30,000 beds made available, 5,000 right off the bat, and First Nations would be a priority. So there were 7 First Nations communities that will receive beds and the first tranche of funding. And there is also a planning grant that you can get from the Ministry of Health to address your needs, to put in a proposal. And currently, with that 30,000 beds that will be made available over the next 10 years or so under the Liberal government promise, I understand that the current Doug Ford government is going to make 15,000 beds available over the next 5 years. I haven't seen that in writing, but I've talked with my contact at the Ministry of Health, and that's what I've been told. So the situation with long-term care in Ontario is very dire. There tends to be a 2-year waiting list for long-term care facilities in the 628 facilities in the province. The occupancy rate is 99%. You almost have to wait for somebody to die before you can get in there. And in March of 2017, there were 30,713 people on the waiting list for long-term care, with an average wait time of 133 days before placement. So I was the representative to deal with Southern Ontario, and I just mentioned the results that we had, which were pretty good within a year. There is a strong political commitment from the Ontario Ministry of Health, long-term care, senior level of government bureaucrats to make First Nations a priority and to work in the development of models that will make this available in First Nations community. There is no one size that will meet the needs of every community, so there will be different models. Some new long-term have now been approved by Ontario, and so these homes will have to be built by the year 2022. I mentioned that Indigenous communities are a priority for these beds. In the area of home care, there's been more money put into home and community care. There is a promise to increase the level of care up to 4 hours per day per client in home care, because the homemakers were saying they didn't have enough time to do what they needed to do with their clients. So we raised that with the Ministry of Health. And so, for example, we were approved for a 128-bed long-term care facility. The Anishinaabe ASCII Health in Toronto was approved for a 128-bed facility. Then there were other communities that received other beds as well. So the 128-bed long-term care will bring a capital contribution from the Ministry of Health of $12 million for that model of 128 beds. So in the area of, so there's been progress made on that file. There had been no, basically, there was a report called Denied Too Long in 1993, and the report basically concluded that there was a long-standing neglected need of long-term care for First Nations on reserve. So apart from Oneida, there had been no other movement to address the issue of long-term care in a quarter of a century. So that's good news. I sit on the Trilateral Health Committee of senior officials of the government, and there's been a strong investment in mental health, particularly for children. And so there's an additional $2.1 billion for mental health and addictions over the next 4 years. Ontario has also increased the annual operation funding for mental health and addictions to $3.8 billion. This brings the total investments in mental health and addiction services in Ontario to more than $17 billion over 4 years. At this point, it's unclear how much of this funding is being rolled out to First Nations and how First Nations can access it. Information is requested from the ministry contacts and at the technical level, but the Ministry of Health communication is an ongoing issue. There is a known lack of mental health and life promotion funding for First Nations that still needs to be addressed. Home and community care. There's been an advisory group established to deal with the community care program provided throughout Ontario, and I believe that Rod, you can clarify this, that Donna Loft was the Chiefs of Ontario rep on home and community care. Yeah. On this advisory group. The advisory group is spearheaded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and the Chiefs of Ontario, and AIA has two reps on this committee. I mentioned there's been an additional investment of money from the province for home and community care, and last year each community received equal allocation of $55,300. There's more money for this year. In our community, I think we're receiving $150,000 this year, so all of you, the agreements have gone out and they should be signed and returned to the ministry. There were 86 communities that didn't have a nurse, so a lot of those communities received money for the first time. Housing, where is that? There's been money from the Liberal government for housing, but most of that money went north. It was very tragic a year ago in December when we saw on the news how children had burned to death here at the Oneida First Nation. And it was really a housing issue, safe housing issue. And the department seems to have turned to the view that the South is rich and doesn't have needs for water or housing, this sort of thing. So we've been pushing the regional office that this thinking has to be corrected, and that there are just as many needs that are just as valid in the South as there are in the North. And so the allocations to First Nations housing should be really looked at. How much the community received from the department over the last 10 years, you'll find that it's flatlined in most cases, while the populations have increased on reserve. And so there's going to be a housing meeting, a strategic meeting on the 19th of April, and Ann Scotton has invited a number of chiefs to attend that meeting. I'm one of the chiefs that have been invited to attend. And so hopefully we can make some progress in the area of housing. And housing directly impacts the child welfare, mental health and wellness, and even human trafficking. The southern community's housing issues are not being addressed as much as those in the north. I would ask the AGA to ask for a report from Indian Affairs where this money has been invested for housing, and to address what the gap is for the South. It is essential that we are more prepared to bring these issues forward. AIA is in the process of trying to secure funding to have a housing policy analyst for a one-person year. Poverty and economic development. Stats Canada reports that 80% of First Nations are in poverty, and some with incomes of less than $22,000 per year. And most of those people would be people on Ontario Works and our senior citizens, or people on ODSP. So there really is a need for some political action to address this level of poverty in those three groups. There's a strong need for the chiefs to educate the bureaucrats and politicians that poverty exists in the South, not just the North. Ontario is committing to raising social assistance supports by 3% annually. The Wynne government raised the minimum wage. Part of it was implemented in this past fall, with another increase supposedly going to occur in January of 2019. And there's some talk that the Ford government might put that on hold. So that's something that the chiefs will have to pay attention to. And there's been some money received from the government for some of the programs to offset the impact of the wage increase, the minimum wage increase. The non-insured health benefit national review process. The national review commenced in 2014. The purpose is to enhance client access to benefits, identify and address gaps in benefits, streamlining service delivery, and to be more responsive to the client needs, and increase program efficiency. There is still concern among First Nations that the review is failing to look at the transformational change and is instead focusing on small amendments to the current program, thereby entrenching the current failing system. There's a concern regarding the extended timelines. The review was originally supposed to be completed by March of 2017. Many issues with the NIHB program are pushed off until completion of the review. In the interim, it is difficult to achieve progress in advocacy. And I've sent, there's some photocopies of what's going on with the Joint National Review Steering Committee. And I guess one of the problems they've had is that they've had a problem achieving quorum for their meetings. So that has slowed the whole process down, and the work is not completed when it should have been. I understand there will be a report given to this to the National Assembly in Vancouver in July. The NIHB National Review Process Update. In the winter of 2017, progress on the National Review had stalled due to staff turnover, lack of commitment on both sides of the table. The First Nations Inuit Health Branch and Assembly of First Nations. The AFN National Navigators Group has been reestablished. They met in April to discuss the outstanding work and to develop a plan for moving forward to complete the process. Timelines for completion are still unclear. A report on the progress achievement so far will be produced by the Joint Steering Committee, comprised of the AFN and FNIB, this spring. More fulsome reports are supposed to be provided at the July and December AFN assemblies, including the AFN risk-benefit analysis of class action suit against the Government of Canada for the operation of an NHB. Note, this analysis was to be provided at the December 2000 assembly per AFN resolution, but was not. There still tends to be many issues that are problematic. Orthodontics, there's many issues, and children's mental health is impacted. Still many issues with claims processing and service provider frustration with the program causing them to leave. In March 27, NR-Can spray became an open benefit for clients under the NHP program, and this is to treat opioid overdose. You need to have, has been added to the NIHB pharmacist-initiated treatment policy, meaning it's eligible for reimbursement when prescribed or recommended by a pharmacist. The person must be at risk, and whoever is buying it the bill has to go to NIHB. Okay. Lice and acne treatments are now open benefits, meaning there's no longer a prescription required. Apparently, communication has not flowed well to pharmacies. Program directors confirm that there are efforts to compare industry standards and bring program areas up to par in each benefit area. These efforts are made through the joint review process. $1 million has been budgeted for traditional healers under the mental health benefit for the fiscal year 2018-19. Commitment was made to look into the veterans' coverage of medical cannabis, and this remains an outstanding issue. New online claims for service providers website. New online claims processor for service providers website now live, which should speed the processing of claims. Indigenous Services has launched a new online mental health counseling services. Services should be monitored to ensure privacy and concerns are taken into consideration. The NIHP program updates. NIHP staff have to directive to do more outreach and travel to service clients, service providers. NIHP staff are encouraging any issues with the program to be reported immediately and see the contact information on the slide so they can better understand the issues and address them as they occur. NIHP program staff are planning to have a one-day session with AIA staff to discuss outstanding issues and next steps. The next slide is just the contacts at NIHP for your perusal. And the legalization of cannabis, just a few points there. The legislation is not yet, it's passed through the Senate, but it's gone back to the House of Commons. It will remain illegal until the Federal Cannabis Act is passed, which will likely happen maybe even before the Parliament recesses at the end of June. We're not sure. And then I understand that the provincial law and the federal law will come into effect at the same time. You can use cannabis at your private residence or the outdoor space at a home, a porch or backyard, unit or your balcony. If you live in a multi-unit building, like an apartment or condo, that depends on your building's rules or your lease agreement. You will not be allowed to use cannabis in a public place, workplaces, or motorized vehicles. Using cannabis in a public place can result in a fine of up to $1,000 for first offense and $5,000 for subsequent offenses. And this has already been touched on earlier in the comments and in the presentations, but again, while the municipalities are going to receive money from the federal government because they're recognized as front lines of legalization, there's a gross oversight of First Nations despite the disproportionate risk factors and potential harms. Ontario is providing municipalities with 1/3 of all federal revenues received based on populations of 10,000. There's no resources identified for First Nations. Health Canada has identified $9.6 million over 5 years, public education, awareness of cannabis. None of this funding is earmarked specifically for First Nations. And at the Chiefs of Ontario meeting that we had, a meeting with this past Friday, the Director General of the Cannabis legislation was there, as well as Diane LaBelle, legal counsel. And while there's money for public education, it's proposal driven. And so this doesn't seem to be a fair way to get money out for public education, so that needs to be addressed. According to Health Canada contacts, there is federal funding for cannabis that is going to the AFN. There is also apparently federal funding for project proposals. Contact Health contacts in the red box there. Ontario says it has no plan for retailers aside from the Ontario Cannabis Retail Corporation, but First Nations are advocating for agreements with Ontario. Ontario stated they're open to discussion regarding agreements with First Nations with terms to be negotiated. And we did meet with Deborah Vincent, councillor, and myself met with, and David Sewell, our CEO, met with representatives from the senior officials of the Ministry of Finance, the Attorney General, and Community Safety and Corrections, Stephen Beckett. And what we were told was that they're prepared to look at agreements, but for a community of our size, we shouldn't have any more than 2 stores. And that the sale of cannabis would have to be restricted to your own members. So really it's more about providing cannabis to your own members as opposed to a commercial operation. So if there's any, this would signal to me that if there's going to be any agreements with the province, they're going to be marginalized and they're not going to be an economic stimulus. So that's a political issue in the relationship with the Chiefs of Ontario and the province of Ontario that'll have to be discussed. Now, I gave you some handouts. Have they been circulated? And it's about the what's going on with the. I'll get them just one.
Oh, he's not done.
So one of the problems with this whole joint review process is that they've had a problem achieving quorums, and there doesn't seem to be much information coming back from this JRSC process, and so they have to improve their communication plan. So I've given you a paper to look at what's going on there. And also what's going on with the whole health transformation system, an engagement process just for information. So that concludes my report. So the handouts you should have, pardon me, are the AFN NIHB Joint Review Communication Plan. There's a resolution that's going to be tabled at the AFN Assembly in Vancouver. The draft resolution is there, and just the whole report on what's going on with this joint review process with the NIHB. I did talk to Heather Larson today to find out who approves issues to be added to the NIHB drug list. And she said Keith Kahn approves some of them. Some of them are approved by Valerie Gideon, and some of them are the pharmaceutical committee, therapeutic and pharmaceutical committee. So in order for it to be covered, it has to be on that NIHB drug formulary. And so that's the process we have. I see that there's some relaxation of the rules for escorts. If people miss an appointment, they may have to pay the next cost for medical transportation if they don't cancel in time. And so there's stuff like that. But I've asked about the communication of these changes. I've been assured by Health Canada and by Suzanne that all of the, that Aaron Bale sends out regularly to your health directors and to the chiefs and to the health directors of the PTOs, all information as benefits are changed or new drugs are added to the list for coverage. So that's the communication process. She said they have not received any inquiries or questions about the changes to date for in any great numbers. That's my report. And if you have any questions on any of the benefits, Suzanne and Tina Powell will be available to answer your questions. Are there any questions?
Don, I got one question for you.
What's
I'm
the
not trying to prolong the day or anything, but you know the Senate had stopped that cannabis process from going forward. Did any of our leadership from either the region or the national meet with the senators on the senators' demands on the cannabis?
What has happened at the meeting on Friday, Chief Randall Phillips was at the meeting and myself, and AFN staff were there. Colleen and Nelson were there, and Jonathan Thompson. There was a representative there that has a cannabis shop in Alderville, and we decided that because there was no accommodation in the federal law, the Bill C-45, to recognize the jurisdiction of First Nations to issue a license and regulate, that it was an oversight. The federal government had an excellent opportunity to entrench in the law the recognition of First Nations' rights to be self-governing, and failed. And of course, you've heard the regional chiefs to say that in the meeting in November something could have been done, but the people that should have been there weren't at the meeting. So there's going to be a letter drafted to go to the Prime Minister, to Senator Mary Jane McCallum, Senator Mary Jane McCallum, and to see what can be done. But right now it's going back to the House of Commons. So if there's any changes that need to be made, everybody needs to get on the blower to Bill Blair and people in the House of Commons to see what changes can be made at this late stage.
Thank you.
And Joel has been requested to sign that letter. We should have a draft by tomorrow, which we'll share with the Assembly.
Any questions? None? Okay, we only have 5 more things. I'm just kidding. Okay, in consultation with my chairs, they said, look at everybody, we got to end this thing. And I said, okay. So we're going to pause for today, and we're going to tackle the resolutions first thing, followed up by the last 2 presentations from Chief Sayre, Chief Stonefish. And I have a bad habit of talking about things that everybody's going to talk about. So this probably shouldn't be too long on those ones. So meeting is adjourned until tomorrow, and thank you for hanging in there for today. And I think our interpreters' fingers are very tired right now, so they needed a break. They are, thank you.